Hello everyone, my name is Skylar Fox, and this is Project Mycer, a 3D action-adventure superhero game I am developing in Unreal Engine. Today, I am going to be talking about a couple of the enemy types that I have made in my game, and particularly the challenges that come from designing far-ranged enemies when the player is a close-ranged fighter. With Project Mycer being a superhero game, a very common enemy type will be the average street criminal, acting as a close-range melee fighter with a basic punch and kick. I also added in a dodging move that they might choose to perform if they detect that the player is attacking, but only if they are not already being hit or in the middle of an attack. They behave not too dissimilarly to how I have the placeholder cube enemies behave, in that they will approach the player and only one or two will try to attack at a time. I don't want to make these enemies too complex, as they are going to be the first enemies you fight in the game during its tutorial. One of the strangely complicated parts about making enemy AI, especially for games with close-range melee combat like this one, is having each enemy detect whether or not another enemy is already attacking the player. Without this, every enemy would just immediately get as close to the player as possible and start attacking all at once, making them very frustrating to fight. This especially rings true for the next enemy type that I worked on, enemies with guns. Designing these enemies was a little trickier than I initially thought, because I had to think about how to make fighting them feel fair when playing as a close-ranged melee fighter. There's of course lots of video games where you're fighting enemies with guns, and they each have their own way of handling it. Shooters often tackle this by encouraging players to use the environment for cover and then attack the enemies from far away. Other games may design these enemies in a way that forces the player to use stealth instead of facing the enemy head-on. And some action games have ranged enemies, but make the projectiles a little bit slower than an actual real-life bullet, so that the player can more manageably dodge them. The latter solution is how I plan on designing other ranged enemies that I'm not going to get into now, but I want to try to explore other solutions for this specific enemy. Another game I looked at to try to get some ideas was the Insomniac Spider-Man game for the PS4, as there are a lot of scenarios where Spider-Man is fighting armed enemies. The main thing that this game encourages the player to do is move constantly, without staying in one spot for too long, which is similar to how I wanted to go about it for this game. In Spider-Man, they also have these visual indicators to show when the enemy is about to fire at the player. I think it works as a way to represent Spider-Man's spidey sense, but I'd prefer to avoid needing to display obvious UI indicators to the player if I can help it. I want to make the combat feel consistent, where the key to knowing when to dodge and attack is through observing the enemy's animations rather than through a particular UI element telling you, hey, watch out. So here's what I ended up with. These enemies have up to 4 different attacks, 2 of which involve firing the gun. The first is they will take a slight step back and do a general full-on auto spray of the area in front of them for a couple of seconds, swaying to the left and right slightly. This attack will do small incremental damage to the player, but it won't cause them to flinch like most attacks do. The second is where they lower their gun slightly and do a single semi-auto shot, which will cause the player to flinch and will do a little more damage. Both of these attacks will have a long trace to check if the player will get hit, but I also made them have a pretty generous cutoff so that the player will be safe at a far distance, even if the enemy is aiming directly at them. Obviously, this isn't the most realistic thing, but for a close-range fighter to be dealing with multiples of these kind of enemies, I felt it was a fair way to handle it. I also created an ammo variable for this enemy, and made it so that these 2 different attacks will take differing ammo values from this variable. When that variable reaches 0, the enemy will be unable to perform these 2 attacks without first doing a reload animation, which exposes them to attacks from the player. The third attack they can do is a melee attack, where they try to physically hit the player with their gun, and the last attack is to throw a grenade from far distances. Similarly to the ammo variable, there is also a grenade variable, which will determine whether or not an enemy can actually throw a grenade, and there will not be a reloading function for grenades like there is for firing the gun. After a lot of minor edits here and there, I'm pretty happy with how the enemies behave so far. While not the first enemy type the player will encounter, they are pretty early in the game, and so I want to create this balance where they feel somewhat challenging to new players, but can also be overcome as the player learns how to play the game. Once I start getting a variety of other people to playtest this, I can get a better sense of whether or not I was actually able to accomplish this. If you have any thoughts on this, or you would like to share any examples of far-ranged enemies in close-range combat games, feel free to leave those in the comments below. That will be it for today's video. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you at the next video.